Hello everyone and welcome to Medicated Housewife DIY, where crafting and mental health come together. My name is Sarah. In today's DIY video, we are making these super easy, a little rustic, a little farmhouse, a little modern with a little bit of spring sprinkled in wood wreaths. Using Dollar Tree tumbling tower blocks, some ping pong balls, and other simple supplies. And you're gonna love them, so stick around and let's go make some stuff and jump right into this. In today's DIY video, we are making 3 gorgeous wood wreaths, perfect for spring. They are farmhouse, rustic, and even a little bit modern while still being neutral and high-end looking decor. Perfect for your home. They are easy to make but very impressive, using mostly supplies from the Dollar Tree and a few other places. Super high-end and budget-friendly, so let's get started. To begin with, for DIY number 1, we are using these wood biscuits. That's what they're called. I didn't name them. You can get these at most home improvement stores. These particular ones I found at Harbor Freight for about $7 for 100 of them. They come in different sizes, and I just got the largest ones. I think that they're a size number 20. That's what it says on the container. I also got some at Home Depot. But these Harbor Freight ones that I have less ridges and markings on them, as you can see here. So I decided to use these. I will link all the supplies I use for you in the description box below. And what I'm doing here is I'm going to paint them with some Waverly antique wax that I thinned out with a little bit of water, just to make it easier to paint on all these little pieces of wood. I do paint all the wood biscuits, all 100 of them, with the antique wax, front, back, and the sides. And I use a baby wipe to rub some of that excess wax off because although I want them fully covered, I don't want them to get too dark. So I do get all that excess wax off of there. So now all of 100 of my biscuits are painted and dry, and I knew I wasn't going to be using all 100, but I did that anyway, just in case. That's my motto. I want to make them look distressed. So I grabbed my Folk Art acrylic paint in the color Camel and some Folk Art chalk paint in the color Cottage White. And again, I'll link all of these below for you. And I mixed the chalk paint with the Camel because I didn't want such a stark white contrast with the brown wood. So I ended up making it just a little beigey. I'm using a rough bristled dry brush and getting most of the paint off of the brush before I start brushing a little of the color onto the biscuits. It's a rough coat of this beigey color, and since I want it to look like it's naturally distressed, I concentrate the brush strokes on the edges of the biscuits and a little in the middles of them so that they start to get that worn out and naturally faded wood look. While the distressed wood biscuits dry, I started to cut out my wreath form, and I used those little bamboo circles that they now have at the Dollar Tree. They come in a package of 2, one's larger, one's smaller. I used these as a template on a piece of white foam board. I just traced the 2 bamboo circles and then used an X-Acto knife to cut out the inner circle. I know some people can actually just draw a nice circle, but I am not one of those people. When it comes to making lines and drawing even the simplest of shapes, I always trace them. I think it's good to know your limitations and to work around them. After I cut out the base for my wreath, I painted the foam board with the Waverly antique wax, and I painted both the front and the back and also the sides, even though the plan is not for anyone to actually see this wreath form under the biscuits. But I still thought it was a good idea that the foam was all one shade of brown. So I felt like the foam wreath form was a little flimsy for all this wood. So I used some Titebond wood glue and I glued a bunch of the biscuits all around the back of the wreath, just to give it a little extra support. Plus I had like 100 of these biscuits, so I figured I could spare them for the back of the project. And just a quick comment, I don't understand why they call these wood biscuits. Like, I know what they're used for, but why biscuits? Clearly, they look much more like a wafer, right? I mean, they should be called wood wafers. I want to start a petition. Let me know in the comments if anyone knows the actual reason why these are called biscuits. This is not a riddle. I really just don't know, and I want to know. Thank you. Before I start applying the biscuits to the wreath, I used some hot glue and I glued them into kind of like a V shape, as you can see here, with one biscuit attached on top of the other. And I wanted it to be even, so I alternated the right side biscuit on top and then the left side biscuit on top, so I would have equal amounts of each. You can see what I'm doing here. I'm not sure if this really makes a difference. I am not the brightest crayon in the box, but I think it helped when I went to space them out onto the wreath. At this point, it was time to assemble the wreath. I used hot glue and placed the first V shape down, and then I placed the next V shape, the one with the opposite side top biscuit, underneath it, and the next under that one, and so on and so on. And each time I glued a V shape down, I was tightly tucking it either under or over the V that was glued above it. It's not complicated. You could see what I'm doing by watching it here. It's actually simple once you start doing it. I don't want it to stop. Even though once I got all the way around the wreath once, I started on a second row because the wreath was just too thin with only one row. And plus, as you know, I had plenty of extra biscuits. So I started the second row on the outside edge of the wreath by placing that first V shape down in between two of the V shapes that are beneath it, so that I was also filling in any gaps where the actual wreath form could show through. I wanted to cover those all up. I then followed the same technique as we did for the first bottom row, and I was alternating the right and the left top side V's and placing them under the V that I had just glued down. Once all the biscuits are glued down onto the wreath form, I started on making a bow. Now, you may not know this, but I am not a bow maker, nor am I a wreath maker, but hey, I'm making wreaths and you and I are about to make a bow. I'm using this wired burlap ribbon from the Dollar Tree. I cut 3 strips of equal length, and then I fold them in half and use some hot glue to close them into 3 separate loops. After I make the 3 loops, I cut another longer piece to use as the tail for the bow. Then I take each loop and scrunch it up right in the middle, and then do the same to the second loop and crisscross them. Then I add the third loop over the crisscross, and I use a small zip tie to hold the 3 loops together in the middle. Then I scrunch the middle of the tail piece, and I use another zip tie to attach it to the back of my bow. I shape out the tail, and then I trim the bottom of the tail. Then I puff out the loops of my bow, and I cut a piece of burlap to glue around the middle of the bow to hide the zip tie, and then our bow is complete. I told you I'm not a bow maker. With the bow complete, I found these white flowers that I had in my stash. They're definitely from Dollar Tree, but since I don't have the labels on them, I just have no idea what kind of flowers they're supposed to be. But I grabbed some of those and I bent the wire to the curve of the wreath. I used some floral wire to bind the flowers together, and then I used that wire to attach them to my wreath. I also found some cut off green flowers that I had in my stash, so I placed them. Also, I don't know what kind of flowers those are either. Sorry, they were just all cut up. So I placed them in with some of the white ones, and off camera, I took a piece of twine and hot glued it to the back of my wreath to use as a hanger. And this is how DIY number 1, my wood biscuit spring wreath, turned out. I think this is so quaint and pretty. I mean, I'd call this farmhouse-ish, rustic-ish. shabby chic-ish, maybe, spring wreath because of the shape of the biscuits looking like leaves and the added flowers. It has a nice, fresh spring kind of feel to it. But tell me what you think. Let me know in the comments if you'd call this farmhouse or rustic or shabby chic or something else. DIY number 2 is a wood square wreath. It's made of Dollar Tree tumbling tower blocks. So the first thing I did was to glue together 24 groups of 3 blocks, glued side to side. I used Titebond wood glue to glue all 24 sets of 3. Although I knew I probably didn't need all 24, I wasn't sure exactly how many I would need, so I glued them all. Using one of the small wire wreath forms from Dollar Tree, I grabbed some burlap ribbon also from Dollar Tree and I wrapped that around the wire form, placed a small amount of hot glue just to hold that piece in place, and then I proceeded to wrap the wire wreath form completely in the burlap ribbon. I secured it at the end with another dab of hot glue. So initially, when I glued those 24 groups of 3 blocks, I had separated them into piles of 6 so that I had 4 piles of 6. And the plan was to stain each of the 4 piles of 6 a different color. But I ended up only using 3 different colors of stain, not 4, so I stained 3 different groups of 8 block squares. You know what I mean. The first color I used was Bin Wax Jacobine, and I stained 8 tumbling tower block squares. I stained both sides and the edges, so everything is covered. I also used a baby wipe and a paper towel to rub some of that excess stain off, and then I set all of those aside to dry. The second color stain that I used was Varathane Ipswich Pine. And again, I will link everything I used below. So I stained the next group of 8 tumbling tower block squares, and I set those aside to dry as well. The third and final stain color was Varathane American Walnut, and that has a nice reddish color to it, and it gives some contrast to the golden and the brown tones that we already have. I stained these last 8 squares with the American Walnut, and I set them aside to dry. So my 3 piles of different color squares are dry, and I took my burlap wrapped wreath form and I decided to use the back of it to attach the squares because the front is rounded and obviously the squares are flat and sit better on a flat surface. I laid the squares out on the wreath before gluing them so that I could get an idea of what order I wanted them color-wise. I decided to place them in a diamond shape, and I was also conscious of what direction the block lines were going on each square because there's 3 blocks and there's lines going across or up and down or whatever, whichever you choose. So I wanted to make sure they all looked right next to each other, and that's pretty much up to you with the line directions. There's no right or wrong with that. It's totally up to you and what you think looks best. I glued each square down with hot glue, and I kept the same pattern of colors going throughout the whole wreath. I started gluing down the squares onto the wreath form until the whole first row was done. Then I started the second row, placing each square on top of and in between the squares underneath it, making an effort to not leave any holes open where you could see the burlap wreath underneath. I felt like the wreath needed something to make it look more alive. So I had this jute twine wrapped with these little leaves that I got on Amazon for a different video. I'll link it below, and I just wrapped it loosely around the entire wreath. I hot glued a piece of that same jute in the back to use as a hanger. And this is how DIY number 2, my Jenga block squares wreath, turned out. I think this is really cool looking. It's definitely rustic, and even more so if you did it without the leafy jute wrapped around. I also think on its own it could be considered pretty modern. It's got a clean, minimalist, or maybe even a little industrial vibe to it, but I want to know what you think. Let me know in the comments what this square wreath says to you. Is it better with the leaves or without? Would you add something different? Let me know. DIY number 3 is a wood bead wreath, but the wood beads are actually Dollar Tree ping pong balls. I got a lot of ping pong balls, like 5 or 6 packs. I had no idea how many I was going to use, and let me tell you, I have extras. I also used a wire hanger that I cut the hook off of, and I bent that into a circular shape. I unpacked the balls and used an X-Acto knife to poke 2 holes into them, using the seam on the ball as a guide to make sure I made the hole in the middle. And then I strung the balls onto skewers, and even though I didn't need that much, I still strung all the balls onto the skewers. Are you sensing a pattern here? The way I'm going to get the ping pong balls to look like actual wood is by using alcohol ink. And I've used alcohol ink to get wood finishes in a couple of other videos. I'll leave the links to those in the description box below if you haven't seen them. But for this project, I'm using these old makeup brushes that I only use for alcohol ink. You do not want to put these brushes anywhere near your face after they've been used with alcohol ink. And I'm only using one color of alcohol ink, and that's the Tim Holtz brand in the color Teakwood. We also use some 91% alcohol, which is not the same as the 71% alcohol that you buy at the supermarket. I put this alcohol into a little cup and I leave my brushes in the cup. And the reason that alcohol is brown is because it's washing away all the ink residue that was left on my brushes that are soaking in there. The easiest way to describe this process is that using the alcohol ink is like using watercolors. The ink is the paint and the alcohol is the water. So you use the alcohol to move the ink around and to lighten it and cut through the color. It's such an easy and fun process and literally goof proof. No matter what you do, you get a really cool looking result. And I can't believe I waited so long in life to start using alcohol ink. You guys should really give it a try. I will link the supplies that I use below. I get my brush slightly wet with alcohol and I drop a couple of drops of ink onto the ball. And I use the brush to move the ink around and cover all the white spots that are on the ball. The more ink that you apply, the darker the overall color will be. And the action of the brush moving straight around the ball is what leaves all those little lines that mimic a wood grain. And we get all these different shades and tones all from one color of the ink. We're only using one color for all of these. You can also use a smaller size brush to push the ink around and to make little circles that mimic wood knots or other kinds of imperfections that you might see in a bead made of wood. It's just so cool. Also, if you feel you messed something up, you can leave a little more alcohol on your brush and use the wet brush to push the ink away from your mess up. Like I said, it's pretty goof proof. I use the ink to make all the balls into wood beads. Also, the alcohol ink completely dries almost instantly and doesn't smudge after it's dry. Yeah, I'm a little obsessed with alcohol ink. After all the balls are painted, I strung them onto the wire hanger that I had shaped into a circle. I fit as many balls onto the circle as I could fit, and I tried my best to keep that circular shape intact. And I tried a couple of different ways to close the ends of my wreath, but super glue wouldn't hold and duct tape didn't work either, so I ended up using a whole heap of hot glue and wrapping black electrical tape around that to secure it. It's pretty ugly, but luckily we will be covering that part of the wreath up completely. I then braided some jute and tied it in a knot around the top of my wreath to use as a hanger. And I then made 3 really basic, quick tassels out of macrame cord that I am showing you here super fast. Next, I had some fern leaves that I got at Dollar Tree. They sell them in bags, and I cut them up and used some floral wire to get the leaves to be a little closer to the stems. I also used some floral tape, which was actually so much easier for that job, so I highly recommend that you use the floral tape if you do this. And then I shaped the leaves into a curve and secured them. I also had some loose flowers in my stash, and I made a little bouquet to place in the middle of the fern leaves, and that would also cover up that awful looking black electrical tape blob that I had there. And this is how DIY number 3, my faux wood bead wreath, turned out. I think this looks amazing, especially considering that those are ping pong balls. I like the way the tassels kind of change it up a little from a regular wreath, and as usual, I am thrilled with the realistic wood effect I got from the alcohol inks. But I'm having a hard time labeling what style this would be. I want to know what you guys think. Let me know in the comments, does this look like real wood to you? What style would you call this wreath? I want to hear from you. And these are all 3 of my DIY spring wood wreaths. You know, I said before, I'm not a wreath maker and I'm not a bow maker, but I think I have to say I did a pretty good job. I think these wreaths are really unique. They're definitely high-end looking, and they've got rustic, farmhouse, shabby chic, neutral, modern, maybe even some boho vibes, maybe. They're all over the map, but I really, really like them. How about you? Let me know in the comments if you have a favorite and how you feel about wreaths made of wood in general. I hope you enjoyed this Medicated Housewife DIY, and if you did, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing. It really helps out my channel. Once again, thanks for watching, and until next time, I'm the Medicated Housewife, and crafting is my medication.